Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife with photographers, cinematographers, conservationists, and scientists. Today's guest is Jeremy Hance, a journalist with experience writing about wildlife, climate change, energy politics, animal behavior, and much more for outlets like Mongabay and The Guardian. We talk about solenodons, venomous, nocturnal, burrowing mammals found in the Caribbean that can trace their lineage back to the dinosaurs. The Sumatran Rhino, a small, hairy rhino on the brink of extinction that does live in Indonesia, but no one ever sees it, as well as Half-Earth, an ambitious yet exciting proposal that aims to be the future of conservation and save life on this planet. It's a really interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my chat with the one and only Jeremy Hance. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I've been following your work for a while now, and I'm a big fan and really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat about the work and conservation in general.
I wanted to jump in with something that we had talked about briefly before, which is an animal that I had never heard about until we were discussing it, called the solenodon. And since we chatted about it, I've done some more research on it, and it's just one of the most fascinating animals that I've come across that I'd never heard about. So can you talk a little bit about what a solenodon is and why you were working with it, and just kind of that whole story?
Yeah, sure. So let's start with what a solenodon is. It's one of these animals, and there are and the longer I do this kind of journalism writing, conservation writing, the more I realize how many strange, wonderful creatures are out there that none of us know about, and not even scientists really.
Right.
Know that much about a lot of these animals, and a lot of them are endangered, like the solenodon. So the solenodon there are two surviving species. There used to be many more, but it's in the larger shrew and mole order. So it's like a giant shrew. Basically, I think when people look at it, they probably think it's a giant rat, but I find them quite beautiful. There's two species. There's the Hispaniola solenodon, and then there's the Cuban solenodon, and the Cuban is far more rare. But I first discovered, I didn't know anything about this. I had been writing about conservation for a number of years. And then there was an organization called the Zoological Society of London, which started what's called the EDGE program, which is this program that's really focused on endangered species that are also evolutionarily distinct. So in other words, they've been separated out from the evolution line for a long time. Mm-hmm. And in sort of non-scientific parlance, if we just want to put a different word to that, they're weird. There's nothing on Earth like them. They're strange and weird animals. And so what the EDGE program did is they put out the list of the top 100 mammals that were both strange, weird, evolutionarily distinct, and endangered.
How does that happen? Sorry, not to cut in, but how does an animal become evolutionarily distinct?
Either an animal branches off and nothing else is related to it, right? Mm-hmm. There's no other animals that are it's only branching off into maybe a single species, and it sort of stays there, and it doesn't change over time. Or what often happens too is you might have an animal that's really successful, branches off into lots of different species, but over time a lot of the species become extinct, and all of a sudden we're left with only one species left. So the solenodon used to have many more species, and they used to roam all over the Caribbean. And before they were in the Caribbean, it's because the Caribbean, the islands actually broke off of the North American and South American plates. They were in North and South America during the dinosaurs, and we can get into that in a second. But basically that's what evolutionarily distinct means. Basically it doesn't have relatives. It doesn't have a lot of close relatives.
Interesting.
So there are lots of other animals that are, like the aardvark, for example, I think is one of the most evolutionarily distinct mammals on the planet. It's a weird kind of pig-like, anteater-like thing, but there's no other animal that's related to it. And that's what makes an animal evolutionarily distinct.
Got it.
Whereas something like a lion, you have lots of relatives, right? You have tigers, you have leopards, you have all these other big cats that are related. Mm-hmm. And so And so, again, in a non-scientific way, you can just say this is a really weird animal. And oftentimes, these animals that are evolutionary distinct are throwbacks. There are animals that are ancient relics that have not changed in a long time, that maybe there used to be a lot more of them, of different species, but they've gone extinct for often a variety of reasons. But in more recent times, often humans. So the solenodon has just 2 surviving species. Well, one species survives in the Dominican Republic and maybe in Haiti, and that's the island of Hispaniola. And the other species survives in Cuba. But so I'm looking at this list of the top 100 most, weird and endangered species at the edge. And I saw this animal at the top, and I'm like, what is this? And I fell into the solenodon rabbit hole. I'm an obsessive person as a journalist, as someone who loves writing and stuff. You get interested in certain things and they grab your imagination and then you can't let go.
100%.
And so so I became for years just weirdly obsessed with this giant rat-like creature, but it's not a rat. And what I think one of the things that really tripped me about it, well, first of all, let me just say a couple things that make it unique. So the animal has, it's venomous. It's the only mammal that actually shoots venom out of its teeth like a snake.
Wow.
Right?
That's crazy.
And so solenodon in ancient Greek means grooved tooth. And so that's how it got its name.
Okay.
The Hispaniolan solenodon is the only animal that we know of in the entire animal kingdom that has a ball and socket joint for a nose. So, like, literally, its nose can twist around a ball. Like, it has a ball for a bone, and then the nose. Yeah. So when you see it, like, you can see this, and the Cuban solenodon doesn't have this, but like this nose can just move in crazy ways.
It's like one of those blow up balloons at a used car dealership. That's just kind of waving around like crazy.
And the animal itself it's nocturnal. It comes out at night and it basically digs around and eats grubs and insects. It lives under the ground most of the day. It's got very small beady eyes because it doesn't need good eyesight. And it makes all these strange sort of chirping, clicking noises, which they think is actually echolocation. So like it sees like a dolphin perhaps, in that it's or a bat, and it's bouncing off. Yeah, it's very strange. And it has these kind of old man crinkly toes and long sharp claws for digging. The Hispaniola solenodon is a beautiful sort of orange tawny color. The Cuban solenodon is a black and white color, and it's smaller. And they're just very weird. But what really just boggled my mind was when I was reading about it is that they've done some research and they've discovered that this animal, the solenodon, is virtually unchanged from the dinosaur period. So we're basically talking about one of the first mammals. Some of the very earliest mammals were small. They were shrew-like, like a solenodon. And they were living among dinosaurs. And most of the time, probably dinosaurs, at least the big ones, would totally ignore them, right? They would have no reason to really interact. Perhaps the solenodon would get into fights with, small dinosaurs or be eaten by them, or it would eat maybe tiny ones. But so this animal, the project that eventually emerged around this animal, there was a conservation research project that lasted for a few years, and it was called the Last Survivors Project. And it's an apt title because this is an animal that somehow survived the comet that hit, the Earth, that wiped out the vast majority of dinosaurs. Of course, some of the dinosaurs survived and evolved into birds over time. But, the vast majority of large animals were wiped out. And this solenodon, probably because it could burrow and live under the earth and live on insects, survived that. And then it survived, millions, tens of millions of years. It floated off onto the Caribbean, survived there when it went extinct on the mainland. And then it survived humans. The first indigenous people come, they wipe out a lot of the population of animals that had lived. There were other solenodons that got wiped out. There are hutias, which are rodents that live in trees. There was... In some parts of the Caribbean, they had hutias as big as black bears, so like giant rodents.
What?
Wiped out. Yeah. That survived monkeys that used to live in Hispaniola were wiped out. So all these animals that humans probably just hunted to extinction or deforested or burned out the land. The solenodon and the hutia, there is one surviving hutia in Hispaniola, and there are other species of hutia around the Caribbean. But they are the only ones that sort of survived. They're the only land-based, not bat
What's a
mammals.
hutia look like?
So a hutia looks like, do you know what a capybara is? A capybara is like the world's largest rodent.
Yes.
And they live in the Amazon, and they're very distinct looking. It looks like a mini capybara with a very long tail, and it lives in the trees. So it's kind of like a squirrel in that that's the sort of the place it takes.
Okay.
But and some of them, they actually have a prehensile tail, like a monkey, where they can like hang and move, and they're incredible. I've seen one in the wild when I was in the Dominican Republic as well. But these are the last survivors, and the solenodon is particularly fascinating to me because I just keep picturing this little thing running around under the feet of the dinosaurs, and then surviving all these cataclysms. And then Columbus, the first place he hits is Hispaniola.
Mm-hmm.
He wipes out the indigenous population. He enslaves them. He murders them. And subsequent European civilizations, basically wipe out all the humans on that island, most of them. And somehow the solenodon survives that. And so it's still here. It's still with us. And now it's got new threats and new struggles. But so I became obsessed with this animal.
Is it doing well on the areas where it lives?
No. It is struggling. So currently the Hispaniola solenodon, it used to be considered endangered. It's now been moved to vulnerable, which is good news. It survives in more habitat than people thought. But where it survives, it's very threatened today by especially dogs.
Okay.
So in places like Hispaniola and Dominican Republic and Haiti, dogs often will just run around strays.
Okay.
Oftentimes they're not even owned by people. There's not a lot of, control over dogs or cats. And the solenodon is sometimes prey to these dogs. They're roaming into the forest. They're looking for food. They'll catch a solenodon. They'll eat it or try to, or they'll kill it probably. And, it's venomous, so it can, but the venom isn't particularly strong. It's probably mostly used to kill insects, and also maybe as a leftover thing in which it had to fight against more perhaps predators way back in the day. No one really knows why it has venom.
Right.
But so dogs are a big issue. Also, Dominican Republic is a developing nation. There's a significant amount of forest, but a lot of the forest is being lost to agriculture. There's a lot of illegal logging for charcoal. And then you have the situation in Haiti, which is quite desperate, and people coming over the border from Haiti. And that's also causing conflict and issues where more forest is being lost for charcoal and for agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the animal needs forest to survive. It needs habitat. And so it's struggling. And I think, to me, the biggest threat today, the solenodon, is really just the lack of knowledge about it, right? The ignorance. When we were in the Dominican Republic, I went with my wife. Most of Dominicans don't necessarily know what this animal is. I've never heard of it. Yet it's there are only 2 mammals that live on land that are native there,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one of them. So, and it's a
Wait, can you say that again? There's only 2 mammals in all of the Dominican.
In all of the
that's
Dominican
native?
Republic that's native. Well, so they have bats, land mammals.
Okay.
So the only 2 land-based mammals that are native, that are survived in the Dominican Republic, is the solenodon and the hutia.
Oh, that's interesting. And then they have a bunch of bats. Well, it's interesting too because it shows that the solenodon's so old, because when you think of islands in general, they basically have no native mammals, because if they're volcanic, they appear out of nowhere, and mammals could never get there by sea, by wind, or through flight or whatever. But if it broke off, then it makes sense that if there was a mammal there when it broke off millions of years ago, then it would still be there. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and if you had gone, 10,000 years ago, or even just 2,000-3,000 years ago, you would have probably found many more species, right? Many more species of solenodon. There was another shrew-like animal that lived there called, I'm going to probably say this, I'm going to butcher this, Neophantes or something. That's a completely extinct family of animals, but it's related to shrews and solenodons. There was, like I said, there was monkeys. There was many more species of hutia, including giant hutia. And so, again, when humans got there, they basically probably wiped them out, or various environmental climate changes may have also done some of them in. So, but these are the only 2 left. And then there's they have a wonderful diversity of bats in the region as well. So I got obsessed with this animal. And at the time, I was working full-time for Mongabay, which is an environmental news site. I think it's one of the strongest. I'm partial, but I think it's one of the best sites on the internet for environmental and tropical news. And I got my start there. And at the time, my boss was incredibly wonderful, and he would basically just give me a certain amount of money every year to go travel somewhere and do some stories on the ground. Because as a journalist, that's like the best of the best, if you can get on the ground and do a story. And so I was like, I want to do a story on this, prehistoric dinosaur mammal. And he's like, go for it.
It's like, I give you one trip a year, and this is what you're choosing.
Yes, and this is what I was that, and I knew that there was a researcher on the ground. I knew that there was this program going on. So I knew that I might have a chance to see the species. And if not to see the species, at least to see where it lives, to hear about it, to talk about it. And I had been to places like the Amazon. I had been to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I'd been to Asia. And so, this was kind of like, I was solely, I think I'm probably one of the only people who's ever gone to the Dominican Republic, which is a beautiful country, beautiful beaches, wonderful coral reefs, wonderful people, wonderful food. And I'm the only one who's ever probably gone to the solenodon, That's like the only reason I went. I'm like, screw the beaches, screw all this,
Yeah,
we did some of that
I'm
too.
gonna go find this shrew.
I'm going to go find this giant dinosaur shrew. Yeah. So my wife and I went there. And in order to find it, we land in Santo Domingo.
Does your wife share
Beautiful
this
city.
passion, or is she like, why are you bringing me on this trip?
No, she knows, for one thing, I'm a nervous traveler. I get very anxious, so it's helpful to have her around.
Okay.
So that was very helpful. She shares my passion for nature and love of it. She wasn't so like obsessed with the solenodon. Vicariously, she understood why I liked it so much, but it wasn't like, but she loves traveling. So any chance for her to go on these trips was a real gift for both of us.
Okay.
I mean, at the time we had our daughter who had just turned 2. So it was a little hard to leave her for 12 days, but I'm like, I got to go see the solenodon while I can. So we go to Santo Domingo, and then we basically hire a driver, a local man who drove us from there to a town called Pedernales. And Pedernales is right on the border of Haiti, and it's a frontier town. It's kind of like the American West in the Dominican Republic. Like it's got its own culture, its own language, its own music. It's very sort of country Western, but Caribbean style. It was very fascinating. Yeah. And so we go there and we meet the researcher, Rosalind Kennerly, and she has been studying the solenodon for a few months out there. She is tracking it. She's catching them and putting radio collars on them to understand their movements. And this is back, I think, in 2013, I'm going to say. 2012, 2013.
Are those radio collars typically intrusive? Like, what is it like I always see the mountain lions, like out here in LA, they always put radio collars on the mountain lions, and I'm like, that looks like it sucks to have on it.
I know, right?
Do you know, do they know how much it bothers the whatever animal gets put on? I'm sure it depends.
I think most scientists are going to tell you it doesn't. I don't know if they actually know.
Okay.
They're going to say, like, we don't think it does. We think the animal goes around. And from my own anecdotal experience, like, the solenodon, after it was put on, seemed fine and went and ran away. It didn't, it was doing it started foraging, looking for insects and stuff. It didn't seem, but it is a large collar with a a little radio thing on it. So I can't imagine it makes life easy, but it's one of those things where what's the benefit versus the drawback? The drawback is you might make this animal annoyed and stress it out a little more than normal, but the benefit is that you can learn a lot about this animal and hopefully then use that for conservation.
Sure.
So I think it's always tricky to find that in science, that drawback.
And what is
the benefit?
What is in that specific scenario? I'm sure they do it for a bunch of different research purposes. Was it more to track their movements, or was it to find different populations and see where this thing was going?
No, it was to track the movements. So we know so little about the solenodon that they don't know like how large the range is, how many dens it's using, where it's feeding. Basically, it's to track where is it at what time.
Okay,
to
cool.
track its movements. So basically, get some very basic baseline data, because no one had ever done that with this species before. No one had really done much research on the species except for sort of the evolution and studies, but no one had ever done actual behavioral research really that much on the species.
Okay, cool.
So we go down there, we hired a guide, and then he drove us, about a 6-hour trip through the most beautiful landscapes and, incredible Caribbean, views of the sea and wonderfulness. And then we get to this town and meet Rosalind. We talk about kind of the thing. And what she has done is she has hired local people, local hunters, people who would be hunting mostly wild pig. So they have a lot of wild pigs in the area now. Again, not a native species, but one that was introduced there and now is kind of hunted for sport and for eating.
Yeah, feral pigs just destroy everything.
Yeah, they do. It can be a big issue. So she's using some local people who have done hunting and guides and who know the forest. And basically, the plan is to go out and find this dinosaur mammal, the solenodon. So we stay up, pretty late till like 10, and then we all get into cars and we drive out there at this point, I'm not entirely sure, like, what's my role here. I mean, I'm a journalist. I'm along for the ride. And then basically Nicholas, who's the main sort of hunter guy, and he's like probably at the time was in his 50s. Very handsome guy, beard, scraggly beard, lithe. He's got his favorite machete that he's had for years around with him. And he knows the forest. Like, I mean, he's a forest dude. Like, it was incredible how much he knew where he was and knew what was going on. This is someone who grew up in the country, but not like Americans grew up in the country. Like, this is a guy who knew how to just get around in like this forest. So we get there, we stop, and then we're like, okay, let's go find the solenodon. And I'm like, how is this gonna happen? Like, how do you like? I assume they're gonna go to the dens and like wait for it to come out, and then use 5 guys to like trap it. No, it's literally just Nicholas walks into the woods, and I follow him, and we both have headlamps on. And we just start running through this woods. And the woods is like low-lying trees, a dry forest, brambles everywhere. This is not like a primary forest where you get like cathedral look. This is like you're just tripping and falling. And I must have fallen so many times. But it was a beautiful, my adrenaline's pumping. It was such a beautiful, wonderful experience. The moon is out. And I'm just chasing this Dominican guy. And he's like just super fast and jumping over logs, and I felt like he was doing gymnastics, and yeah, don't lose me. And there was a few times when he would get way ahead and I didn't know where he was, and I would just stop and be like, he knows where I am, he's gonna come back to find me. And he did. But basically his senses are so keen that he can hear the solenodon moving in the forest, and then he will go and try and catch it by hand. Like, he will leap on this animal that is venomous,
Wait, by
and he will catch
grab
it.
them?
Yes, grab them by hand with gloves, but literally pick them up by hand.
Are they as fast as like a rat?
They're fast. They're pretty fast. They're a little funny because when they walk on land, they sort of wobble. They look like they're totally drunk, like they've had a few too many pints. But they can still run scurry fast when they want, when they're feeling like they're
crazy.
Yeah. So we're running through this forest, and there's a number of times where he's like looking at the nose pokes and he's like, oh, this is a week old and this is a day old, and I'm like,
the nose of the
where the nose is going into the ground to find food. Yeah.
I always think it's fascinating how if you've spent a lot of time in urban areas and then go somewhere where people haven't, like they just happen to live out in the wilderness or by the rainforest, how you realize evolutionarily you're much more keen to like be good at living out in the wilderness than you ever thought. I mean, I was reading a book called Grizzly Year, which is awesome if you haven't read it. It's about a Vietnam vet who goes and he tracks grizzlies for like his entire life, because when he comes back from the war, he just doesn't like living in civilization and just kind of likes to camp out on his own in Yellowstone. And the way he was talking about how quickly his senses readjusted and he could track birds and understand like when they might be going to find food or when they might be fleeing from a predator, or when just understanding all the symbiotic relationships of the natural world and how a human can actually pick that up. To me, like I would watch like Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, and you'd see Aragorn, who was the ranger tracker, and you'd be like, nobody can actually do that and like track animals or track people, and they can. It's just that when you're living in a concrete jungle, you just have zero use for it, and those senses become dulled.
Yeah, they become real lazy. And, I mean, I grew up on a farm in the country, but I never had senses like this, like, and even just going, like, it would probably, part of it, I think, is just the sense of dolly, and also the fact that these people have spent years of their lives in these forests and they know them.
Right.
It's not threatening to them. It's not scary. It's just home. I've been with indigenous people in the Amazon, and like following them was similar experience. And like, I'm just falling over and I'm sweating like crazy, and he's just like, whatever, and he's following monkeys to show them to me. And the one thing they always say in the Amazon to tourists and journalists too is don't ever step off the path, never leave the path. And the first thing you do is you're chasing an indigenous person off the path. Yeah. Because they know the area.
Right.
But yeah, it is so incredible to see what, and then you think back to like, okay, humans during the Pleistocene, no wonder we were able to hunt the way we were, and no wonder how in tune we must have been to nature, because you can see what happens to just modern day people who have lived much more closely with nature.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm chasing him through the forest, and I'm completely useless in this scenario. I'm not going to catch the solenodon. I'm not. In fact, I'm probably worse than useless. I'm probably a big hindrance because I'm making so much noise.
Right.
But eventually, he's running around, and he takes a few cigarette breaks and stuff. But eventually, I hear him start shouting in excitement as he leaves me at one point. He'll leave me to sit, and then he'll go and try and catch one. So he shouts in excitement, and I run over to him, and he's literally has a solenodon in his hand. He's holding it up by the tail. The reason they do that is they seem the least stressed out when they're held by the tail, as opposed to holding them by the body. And at that point, she seemed relatively calm. She's just kind of wiggling around. It was a beautiful female. And I'm just kind of like, oh my God, after, 5-6 years of obsessing about this animal, reading everything I could, which is not much because there's only a few papers at the time. I bought books online, even though they would just mention it briefly. Like, I was crazy. I'd watch YouTube videos. Here I am actually in the presence of this animal. And then he's like, here, take it. Like, holding the animal out to me. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm a journalist. I don't touch things.
Yeah.
Like, I don't take things. This is not my job. I'm supposed to be the independent observer. He's like, no, please take it. Because he's got a bag. He needs to put the solenodon in the bag to get it to the researcher. And so all of a sudden, I'm holding on to this solenodon. And I'm like, in my head, I'm just like, I'm touching something that has, survived all these cataclysms that's here. And it was a really... it's one of those things where it made all the planning for this trip, leaving my daughter behind for 12 days when she's 2, it made the whole journey worth it, right? Like, that one moment made it so worth it to be in the presence of this animal. It was a real honor, and I know it wasn't pleasant for the animal, but for me, it was a real honor. And I also knew that, as a journalist who's done a lot of writing about science, I knew that there was a purpose to this. We weren't just catching the solenodon for fun. So we put the solenodon in a cloth bag, and then Nicholas realizes he's misplaced his machete, so he goes off to get his machete, and I'm just sitting there again alone, like just adrenaline going through me, being like, I'm holding this thing in the bag. It's kind of like if you had taken me at 13 and shown me a velociraptor,
right,
after Jurassic Park had come out. I mean, I was just so enamored and so excited. And then Nicholas came back. We go back and we go to the researcher, and it's amazing to watch researchers when they have to handle animals, because they do things so quickly. She had everything ready to go. They take the animal out. They do a few quick measurements, take some samples, and the animal at this point, now that we're not holding it by the tail, it's stressed. It's spitting, it's shitting, it's doing all these things. It's not a happy animal. So the researcher knows. She had warned me ahead of time. Like, look, it's not going to be pleasant for about a minute. And so they do all this stuff. They get the collar on.
Are they
do
loud?
It remarkably quickly.
Screaming?
It was screaming. Yeah, it was squealing very loudly. Wanted to get away, understandably.
Yeah.
In its mind, it probably thinks we're going to eat it. And so it was clearly, and it's one of those things where, when people say animals are automatons, when people describe animals as not having any emotion or feeling, it's like that. It's the most ludicrous idea, because, you go around any animal and you can tell that they have, connections and emotions and feelings, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So, this animal is in distress, basically. But they work incredibly quickly. This is a team that had worked together for a number of months. So very quickly, they do what they need to do to get the vitals. And then they put the collar on. And then, really, we only spent a few minutes with this animal. And then Nicholas picks it up in his hands and just goes and takes it into the forest, sets it down, and my wife is snapping photos, and I'm just like, ah! And that was my, 5 minutes with a solenodon, but it was, something I will remember the rest of my life, and one of the coolest moments of my life in a career-wise, just to be able to have that honor of meeting this animal, and I think in writing about it later and taking what I kind of take away from that is both the wonderfulness of this animal surviving this long, and then the tragedy of the fact that no one knows about it, and it's basically a species that is ignored by most conservation groups, and now we are perilously close probably to losing the Cuban solenodon. And as far as I know right now, there's no one really doing any, the research program I was out there for is ended. It's complete. And the conservation program is done. And there are some great conservation groups doing really good work in the Dominican Republic. But as far as I know, no one's doing specific work on this species anymore.
What was the reason for it being I don't think downlisted is the right word, but changed from endangered to vulnerable.
Sure.
Is it doing better?
No, it's not doing better. It's one of those classic moments in science where they just realized they didn't know. We knew so little about it. They didn't realize it was in more places than they thought.
Okay.
So basically, its range expanded. When they would discover it in places, they're like, oh, we didn't realize it was here. And they would discover it and doing these surveys, right? And so they expanded its range, so they realized, okay, it's got more habitat than we thought, and it's in more places, and so that's why it was downgraded to vulnerable, which is a great news. Really good news.
But it's also funny, like how they dictate, like what's considered endangered and what's considered vulnerable. When I think that the bar just gets set lower and lower because we're just losing more and more species, right? Like so many animals I know have lost like 80% of their population in just the last like 20 to 50 years, and then I think that the whole scale gets put down when they're like, well, there's just because the whole sample size of how many wildlife animals there are is lower than which ones are endangered and which ones are vulnerable gets.
And from the solenodon's point of view, nothing changes, right? The solenodon had always been in those places, we just didn't know it. And the solenodon is still being eaten by dogs and losing habitat. So nothing really materially changes for it. But we just changed the thing because we didn't realize it was in more spots.
And the Cuban one's doing really poorly, right?
Yeah, so I think the last time the Cuban one was spotted was 2003. That's what I've read most recently.
Oh, wow.
There was a group that went out maybe a year or two ago to do some work on bats in Cuba and also to look for it, and I don't believe they found it. I'm not sure. They might have found some signs. But yeah, that one is really on the edge. It's one of those things where if you had enough people going in and doing a big survey, maybe they'd find that the population, because it's in a particular national park in Cuba, maybe they would find the population is doing better than they expected. Who knows? But on the flip side, it might already be extinct.
Right.
One of the issues there is it's a smaller it's smaller than the Hispaniola solenodon, and there's mongoose that have been introduced into Cuba, which are also in Hispaniola as well, and that will prey on the Cuban
vicious.
Solenodon. Yeah,
guys.
Mongoose can be real. Yeah, and they're not meant to be there. And these animals had lived for a long time without any mammalian predators, right? So solenodons are not used to having mammals try and eat them, and then all of a sudden you got cats, you got dogs, you got mongoose, and well, what's going to happen? The population is going to take a hit and potentially extinction. And part of my interest in the solenodon is also that I love the underdog stories. I love the stories about these animals that I'd never heard of or didn't know much about. And the stories of these animals that where you have a passionate small group of scientists or conservationists that are dedicating their time to something that nobody knows about and no other group will touch because it doesn't have the big, rhino, lion, tiger kind of play that you can do with the media and make money.
Right.
You can get a lot more funding to save tigers than you're going to get to save solenodons. And I think that's a sad travesty about the state of conservation, but so I try to promote species that don't get as much attention whenever possible.
Yeah, it's funny because you almost need to find the sweet spot of anonymity and not becoming overly too popular. You know what I mean? Because
yes.
There's part of like just leaving them alone, which can be fantastic as long as their habitat is not getting destroyed or there's some other like invasive species problem that you don't know about. But then you look at tigers or elephants or cheetahs and they're so popular that, they get the funding, but they're also getting chased down by 30 cars a day of people trying to find them. But, and then,
and I've seen that experience myself when, traveling in places like Kenya and Botswana, there's a mixed blessing there.
But you also take it a step further and you're like, well, that also is ecotourism, which is fueling the ability to be able to keep those habitats in the first place. And then all of a sudden you understand why conservation can get more and more complex.
It's so complex, yeah, and I think that we almost drown in that complexity. But yeah, I think the fame thing, can be a double-edged sword. But the problem, I think, for a lot of these unknown species is that none of these species now are unaffected. There's really nowhere you can go on Earth anymore where you could say humans aren't affecting a species, whether it's the deepest part of the ocean or whether it's Antarctica, whether it's the rainforest. Like even if the habitat's there. Even if the species is unknown, and even if it's, maybe a species that's relatively common in a particular area, it's still being hammered by something.
Right.
Whether it's climate change, whether it's overhunting, whether it's, invasive species like dogs, cats, mongoose. So I love to, I mean, part of it's just my own curiosity, but I do love to try and shine a light on these species. It's hard though, because I'll write something about lions or elephants, and that will get a lot more attention than if I write about the Solenodon or the Sumatran Rhino or some deep sea fish, or even something like the vaquita, which is basically functionally almost extinct. It doesn't get the same amount of attention, and editors are much less likely to want to do a story on something like that than they are a big splashy animal that we've done stories and stories and stories on.
Is the Sumatran rhino similar to the Indian rhino?
So the Sumatran rhino is in its own genus. It is totally different from all the other rhinos.
Interesting.
In some ways, I feel like we should just come up with a new name for it. I mean, it is a rhino, but so the Sumatran rhino, it's another one of these really bizarre and again, evolutionarily distinct species. There is nothing like it on Earth. It is hairy. It is the smallest rhino on Earth. It's still large. It's still a huge animal, but it's much smaller than normal. Like what you think when you think of like Indian rhinos or African rhinos, big land animals.
Yeah.
The Sumatran rhino is quite a bit significantly smaller.
How hairy? Like fully hairy?
So it depends on the animal, but basically it's the bottom half will often have kind of like long hair, and you might not even really notice it unless you get it wet or muddy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll see this huge frock of hair
Interesting.
on the bottom half. It's most closely related to the woolly rhino, which we wiped out. And of course, the woolly rhino was covered in hair. It's also the most vocal of the rhinos. So it will sing to you. It sounds like a dolphin.
Wow.
It'll constantly chattering. Whenever I've been around these rhinos, they just come up to you, they like rub their head against you, and they just chatter away and sing.
Oh, that's cute.
And they have various noses. Yeah. And, this is a large, beautiful mammal that's one of the most endangered large mammals on the earth. And no one has ever really studied its song or its sounds. No one knows why it's doing this. No one knows. I mean, I've talked to people who spend their lives with the captive ones, and they have their theories about, they'll tell me like, oh yeah, when it's singing this way, it means this, it's hungry, or it wants to go back in the forest, or it wants me to rub its feet. They'll have like literally, but no scientists, I think there's been one short study on the sounds, and I think there might be somebody working on it soon, but nobody has, and to me, that's crazy. You have an animal that's making noises like a dolphin. That's a large animal. And no one's researched that. Like,
I know, it's crazy.
And one of the reasons we think that it makes these sounds is that the rhino lives in deep, dense forest in Indonesia. There's none in Malaysia anymore. It used to be in Malaysia. It used to be actually all the way into Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. They used to have a huge population into even northern India before it got wiped out. So today it only survives in Indonesia. But, the reason they think it sings like this is that it's in this deep, dark forest, and that's a way of communicating to other rhinos perhaps far away.
Sure.
It's a solitary animal, but they come together for mating. And obviously for mothers and calves, the mother will raise the calf, I think, for a year to year and a half or something. Say the calf will stay for quite a while. And the mom and calf will, call to each other all the time. So it's another one of those really amazing, beautiful, strange animals, and I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Sumatran rhinos and write an incredible amount on Sumatran rhinos, and it's a fascinating story. But it's another one of those animals that kind of gets overlooked in the fact that it's just, people know rhinos, but they don't necessarily know the Sumatran rhino. I was in Cincinnati recently, where they had the first Sumatran rhino births in the zoo there in captivity.
Oh, wow.
In over 112 years. Yeah, they did this in 2001 was the first birth. And I'm doing a whole series right now on the history of this animal, the conservation history. And I was talking to someone who worked their entire career to save this species. And she said when people would see the species in the zoo, they would think it was just a large, pig. Like they wouldn't know, and they just kind of look at it and walk by. They wouldn't sit and really spend time with this animal, which I have flown to Indonesia and to Malaysia to spend time with this animal.
Have you seen them in the wild?
No, nobody's seen them in the wild. The only thing that's ever, it's crazy because so there was a researcher who wrote the first real ecological treatise on this animal back in the 80s, Nico van Strien. He spent months in Sumatra. And from what I heard, he's passed away, but from what I heard from other people who knew him, they said he'd never seen one in the wild. I've talked to rangers who have seen the Javan rhino, which is in one park on Java, maybe 30, 40 times, and they've seen the Sumatran rhino once.
Is the Javan rhino similar to the Sumatran rhino? Like hairy?
So this Javan rhino is more closely related to the Indian rhino.
That's so interesting. I think. Wait, so how do they know it's not extinct?
How do they? So we know from camera traps that there are a few left in the wild, but nobody, despite decades of work on this animal, can tell you how many are left.
You would think if they're singing and they're rhinos, they're not as big as a normal rhino, but they're big animals.
But
they wouldn't be too hard to find.
You would think,
yeah.
But they are so they spend almost all their time in wallows during the day. So like they'll build a big wallow and then they'll just sit in it during the day during the hot times, and then they'll come out at night and feed. But the problem is we're talking about large areas of rainforest, and we're talking about a large animal, but the animal is so rare that it's just never seen anymore. And so the only way you can really find it is camera traps. Now there's a lot of people who will say, well, we can find footprints and we can find markings, but the footprints are easily confused for tapir. Mm-hmm. Tapir and Sumatran rhino can look quite similar. And, if you spend a lot of time in a rainforest isn't like the African savanna. You can walk in a rainforest, you can spend weeks in a rainforest and not see a large mammal. I've never seen a jaguar, for example, and I've been to the rainforest, to the Amazon 3 times and spent several weeks there. I've seen a tapir once, but it was a tame tapir that the indigenous people hand raised, so it just would come out and hang out at the lab.
Right.
So I've never seen a wild tapir, and I've spent quite a bit of time on rivers, so you can go through these areas and like not see any large mammals at all. And this is a very solitary animal. It's obviously learned, I think, throughout the last few thousand years to be scary, very afraid of humans.
Yeah.
And the other problem is that people assumed there was rhinos in areas where really there weren't no rhinos left. The rhinos had died off. They'd either been poached out, or perhaps even more likely, the population got so small that through inbreeding and through just not finding each other anymore, the rhinos just vanished.
Are they poached similarly for their horn?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's even been, in the last few years, there's been recent discoveries of Sumatran rhino horn in Indonesia.
No way.
So they're probably within the last couple decades but they're so rare now and so hard to find, it's even very difficult for poachers. But
yeah, but that's fucked up. If you imagine that, like nobody's seeing these things in 10 years, you finally see it. And there's a lot to unhash there. There's a lot more that goes into it than just single people. There's a lot of socioeconomical factors that make that a reality. Yes. So I'm not trying to downplay that either, but it's just sad.
No, it is really sad. I'd hear stories about, these remote parks where, park rangers, they only have so many park rangers and you can only, look, but like all of a sudden they'll spot poachers in this insanely remote area that must have spent, a week or 2 weeks hiking, trying to find, rhinos, tigers, elephants, any kind of thing to kill basically and bring back to China or Vietnam.
What is the expected number of these rhinos out there? Like, do they have like a general idea?
Sure. So there's 9 in captivity, including 2 relatively recent births in the last, I think, 6 years. So that's the good news. The official estimate is under 100, right? Officially.
Wow.
When I did a big series on this for Mongabay, which people can look at if they're interested in getting a lot more detail. When I looked at it, when I would sit down and talk to researchers, one of the first things I'd ask is, okay, how many are in this park? How many are in this park? How many are in this park? And then I'd get these different responses. And basically what I ended up finding out was worst case scenario, we're talking about probably less than 30 animals, maybe around 30 animals. Now that's worst case scenario. I'm not saying there's only 30 animals.
Yeah.
I would say we're probably looking somewhere between 50 and 80 or 40 and 60, but I don't know.
But that's collectively, right? Like that's
collectively, and that's in 4 different sites.
So is that even possible for them to survive without interbreeding to get to like a sustainable level?
So I would say, first of all, in one site, there's probably between maybe 1 or 2, maybe up to a dozen, but I think that dozen is really a red herring. I don't think there is. They don't have any proof of the dozen. They're just guessing.
Yeah.
Which is what people have been doing with this animal for a century, and it doesn't work. We have proof of 1 or 2 left. In another site, it's between 0 to 10 to 15. And again, no one has any photographic proof. What they have is they have footprints and twisted branches and wallows, which could all be other things.
When does it get to a level that they're saying, okay, this is going to go extinct unless we intervene and take them all out and do some crazy breeding process?
That's what's the talk is right now.
Okay.
So you've had a few scientists saying that for a decade. Like, basically, we need to get all the Sumatran rhinos out. We need to breed them like crazy. But the breeding program had been going so horribly for so long. The rhinos were just dying and no one was getting babies. That was like, don't go there. And now it's completely changed. And now all of a sudden we have scientists basically saying, okay, we need to get more and more animals into the breeding program.
Well, there was a big issue, right? Wasn't there one that was tried to be captured and died?
Yes. So the most recent capture, a female named Najak, she died about less than a week after she was caught. And there was a lot that went wrong with that capture. I'm going to be writing about...
How long ago was this? Sorry.
This was, let me just look up real quick, just so I get the date right, because I don't want to get... 2016.
Okay.
So she was captured. A lot went wrong with the capture. She had a snare wound. And I'm going to be writing about this in a new series coming out in Mongabay, so I'm not going to give too much into this. But she had a snare wound and she perished. There's more to the story than that. I don't want to get into it here right now because I feel like that'd be a little bit... I've done other research. And I feel like I want to let the sources that I talked to speak to what actually happened.
Is that just not to pry, but is that
sure.
Like not malevolent, but like not proper care, like almost like it's like a bad thing, or it's just complications?
I don't want to go. I think I will say things went wrong. To understand the complexity here, it's incredibly difficult to catch a large animal like that in the wild. In the
rainforest, too.
In the rainforest. They have to wait months in remote... I mean, the only reason the animal is still there is because it's so remote. Very few people are in that area. They have to wait months, and then they have to try and catch it. Most of these animals in these areas are older. Sometimes they're sick. They often haven't been breeding. Sometimes they have cancer. And in the past, there has been a number of fatalities at the catch site. It's hard to catch a large animal like that. So we're talking about something that's incredibly risky to begin with. I will say that given all that, still stuff went wrong and things are not done right. But again, you're talking about a really difficult situation. People have to make calls. They have to make decisions. They have to try and do what's best. Shit happens. Well, any conservationist or field scientist knows how that goes.
It's just...
That doesn't mean that we can't fix things for next time.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think how complicated this can be, or more just how gray and convoluted this can be when you have a population of animals that you don't know how many there are. Likely there's too few that they almost have to be captured to be bred and put in with a stable population. But actually capturing them is so difficult that, I mean, the press that the WWF got from that exposure almost makes people be like, don't touch them. But then if you don't touch them, they likely could go extinct. And I hate hearing about those scenarios where animals are brought in and had to be bred and then brought back out, because you always feel like you're losing a bit of the authenticness of the wild animal themselves. But I don't know. It's just such an interesting, when you factor in all those different variables, it's such an interesting, Yeah, it is. And we're talking also, I mean, I should be clear here too, that this was an animal that was living basically by herself, maybe one other rhino in the area, also a female. So she doesn't have any chance to mate. Right. She would never have reproduced, probably. I mean, I can't say that probably 100% sure, but I don't think WWF has any evidence of another male in the area. So, you either catch her for breeding purposes, hopefully, or you leave her there to die, and not ever breed. Now, maybe, she probably could have lived longer in the wild. I don't know. But that was the situation, and so there are two populations of this animal. One in Waikambas National Park, which is where the sanctuary is that I visited, and also in Lucer, that may or may not be viable. There's potential there that these populations could be large enough that if well protected, they could start to rebound, but we don't know. We really don't know, and no one could tell me with any surety, or no one could show me. Some people would tell me, oh yeah, no, we have enough animals here, but they don't have the camera traps to prove it.
And we've learned in the past that if you don't actually have really good physical evidence, it's when I first met my first Sumatran rhino, they kept saying there was 40 Sumatran rhinos in Borneo, in Sabah, where I met this rhino. This is Malaysian Borneo. Turned out there was 0. Or maybe, no, I shouldn't say 0. There was probably 2 or 3.
So the Sumatran rhino is gone?
From Borneo. Not from Borneo, sorry, from Sabah.
Okay.
It's extinct in Sabah, this particular area. They thought it was gone from Borneo entirely until WWF discovered this population that where Najak was from. She was from a population in Kalimantan in Indonesia and Borneo. It gets very confusing because of all the different places.
Well, I also think from a layperson's perspective, the confusing part of it is when the name of the animal is assigned to a geographic location, like the Sumatran rhino or the Sumatran tiger or whatever, that people almost, when you hear they're going extinct, people are like, oh, well, they're just talking about this small subsegment of an animal that's everywhere that is going extinct on this one small little island. Not that they're trivializing it, but it doesn't seem like, it doesn't feel like you're actually losing a species. But the reality is it's a completely different species, and it's not only found in just this one geographic location, but you're losing something huge. And unfortunately, I think just the way that it's been named confuses people to that.
The way we name animals in general has always driven me crazy. It should be called like the hairy rhino or the little rhino or the pygmy rhino. That would get it so much more attention, right? If you called this the hairy rhino or the pygmy rhino, people are like, oh, it's so cute, but because of, you're totally right. And the thing is, we named it the Sumatran rhino because it was found on Sumatra when the scientists, the Western scientists came and said, oh, look, it's a rhino.
Right.
But, a few thousand years before, they were in Myanmar. They were in India. This is not the Sumatran rhino. This is an Asian rhino that belongs to its entirely own genus, And so that does, and it gets very confusing when you're trying to explain all of those different things. And it's like the solenodon. It's an animal that requires context to get people interested. Yeah. Right? You have to be like, no, wait a second. It's hairy. It sings to you. It's the most sweet. It's like a giant cat. It'll rub its head against you. This is a crazy species. Yeah. And yet most people maybe have heard of it, but don't know any of the context, including Indonesians. Indonesians know all about the tiger. They know about the tiger. They know about elephants. But you talk to them about the Sumatran rhino, and most of them are not really going to know why it's important and what makes it different from, the white rhino now.
Right. I talk to photographers about this all the time, about how do you strike that balance of, there's so many awful images that you can put out that are doom and gloom and like, we're losing these species and you want people to care. But at the end of the day, you almost need to educate people in the first place to get them to give a shit. You know what I mean? Like, yes. Like to me, like one, you need to be educated that the Sumatran rhino is not just an Indian rhino that lives in Sumatra, but also that it does sing and it does nuzzle against you. And it is this really cute and unique animal. And then, oh, by the way, there's potentially 30 left in the world, and then people care, you know what I mean? But finding that balance and the timing of delivering that message is so complicated.
Yes, it is really complicated, and it's really hard, as a journalist, I think all journalists dealing with this is trying to get your story to matter, because most of the time you're throwing your story into the ether of the internet, and you just hope somebody reads it and cares and does something, that's kind of our job, right? And how, when you're environmental journalists, it's even more, because very few people read the environmental news, and the ones that do usually already care. So how do you reach an audience that's bigger, that's different? And I've tried every way in the book, I think, and I don't think I've found a way that's successful in the sense of like it reaches everybody. Different messages work on different people, I think, but it's incredibly daunting to get people to care when we have all these other things going on, and we're so distracted and there's so much news. To break through that and get people to read something about a solenodon, for example, or the Sumatran rhino is really a challenge.
Yeah, and that's why I gravitate towards podcasts in the first place. I think I mentioned this to you in a previous chat that we had, but it's the one form of media that consistently, assuming you're going to the right places, not the one form of media, because writing and everything, et cetera, but long format in general is found in podcasts, and they actually get into stories and talk about things, and you hear different perspectives and you get granular details and you have long form conversations, and if it's debated in a sophisticated way where people are actually having a discussion around things, as opposed to a lot of media, which has gradually shifted to these sensationalized headlines and everybody wants to be the first to put it out. So there's like 2 paragraphs and it's all super extremist or extremist examples because that's the only thing people will click on. And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't really know if I understand the story whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm always listening to podcasts, because I feel like it's the one method I have. Also because I really don't like reading for 45 minutes at a time because I'm usually doing it while I'm at the gym or something like that, that I feel like I can actually understand a story in its entirety, you know? And I think that that's what I really respect a lot about your work too, is, I mean, if you read your solenodon story, if you read the new project you're coming out with that we can talk about in a little bit, they're long form. I mean, they're long articles that give different perspectives, provide examples, and it's interesting. You know what I mean? And I think in this current day and age, it's really hard to find that.
It's really hard to find, and it's really hard to. The problem is, it's not even just our attention spans. It's so hard to fund it, right? To fund journalists to be able to spend a long time on a story, to be able to do the research, to be able to talk to more than 2 sources, to fund them to be able to do that for a story that might only get, however many clicks. That's where the breakdown has come in journalism today, is trying to fund these really good, long, contextual stories. And I think to me, the most powerful stories are the ones where the journalist is actually there.
Yeah.
The journalist can put you in a place, they've actually gone and visited someplace physical. And those are even more hard to fund because then you're talking about travel costs.
Yeah.
But those are the kind of things that I personally love to write, and those are the things I got into this. I started out as an English major, and I got a master's in what's called the Great Books program. So I'm a book reader. Like, I love long, and the longer the book, the better.
Right.
I'm a huge fan of 19th century, novels that just go on and on and on. So
I'm more of a
when
Harry
I
Potter
write,
guy myself.
well, those can get quite long too.
That's true.
Those. I mean, J.K. Rowling loved to draw that on, and in a way that was blissful. She created that whole world, right? And that's what I love. I love being immersed in a world like that. So when I write, editors, bless them, deal with me always sending more than I should. They'll be like, here's your word count, and then I'll send them double that. I'll be like, I'm sorry, can
you edit
I just want you to look at what I have, and can we edit, or can we just keep a little? And then I see about the internet, honestly, is you're not competing for space anymore. It's not like a sheet of paper, a newspaper where you're competing with. You actually have to really be concerned about, what you're competing for is attention span.
Right.
And you're competing for the willingness for someone to, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else, to read past the 2 paragraphs. The first 2 paragraphs, and to actually read the full article. But those are the kind of things that we read or listen to. I agree about podcasts is the same thing. That really stick with us. Reading the first 2 paragraphs, reading the headline, yes, you're going to get the basics of the news, and sometimes you have to do that. But I think we're bombarded with too much information, with too much news, way more than is healthy for us. And at the same time, we're losing the ability to listen to long stories. Our ancestors used to sit around the fire, and you'd have a storyteller. In ancient Greece, you'd have Homer tell you a story for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Through poetry.
Well, it's changed, right? Like, where we've gone from living in a world where we had to be sponges to living in a world that we have to be filters. I mean, I think for me, like, my news intake it's not that I don't have enough intake. It's I have to filter out what's bullshit. I need to have enough time to read through all of it. It's just the entire way in which you consume information and learn has changed. Yes.
And that the filtering out process used to be the purview and the job of journalists and editors. The whole point of journalists and editors is to try and speak truth to power and to find context and to tell a good story, but do it in a way that's like getting to the nuggets of truth, right? And now we have, because of the internet, because of this tool we've created, all of a sudden we're asking the reader to try and filter out all the BS. And you see that on social media all the time. I mean, I have people, on social media will ask, well, is this story true or not? And you'd be like, no, that's that's completely made up. Like, but they have to do the work. They have to go and ask. And that's too much to ask of most people, right? Most people are going to get overwhelmed, or they're just going to believe whatever news site they think is most in line with their views. And they're not going to, it's too much to ask. So we used to have this place for journalists where, like, journalists would go and kind of do that work for you behind the scenes, because that's a lot of what we do is behind the scenes. We're doing that contextualizing work. We're doing that dealing with these complex issues and then trying to put it in words and then delivering something that is at least gives you the context, gives you some kind of truth, gives you some kind of reality. And now, because of the way our internet is, and that's bled into our politics, we're making you all do it. And that's a terrible way to run a society.
Yeah, and you used to you'd gravitate towards people that there was like a level of trust with the journalist that covered these stories. You'd say, okay, well, I've been reading so-and-so, this guy, this woman for 20 years, and I respect the way in which they do their job, and I trust them as a way to take in that information.
Exactly. And you respect that they're going to have a certain amount of independent observers, but you also respect that they're a human who's going to have views.
Right.
And you might disagree with your views, and that's fine. I mean, journalists, like, it's weird because we're asked to be, independent observers, and everything has to be this bullshit balance, which is totally a fake thing. But we're human. We're just doing our job, and we're doing it to the best of our ability. And yes, we're trained in certain methods in which to tell, a story with as much context and truth as possible. But we make mistakes. We are still human. We are still dealing with our own issues. I mean, if you look at journalism, 100 years ago, it's virulently racist.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Like
what is happening in society bleeds into journalism too. We aren't perfect. We're not, but yet we have always played a kind of role in giving news in a way that allowed people to get more context and to make up their own mind about certain realities. And now we're unfortunately asking people to figure that out themselves. And it's just, that's not sustainable, I don't think. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of that in our world right now, of asking people to try and filter out what's real and what's not.
Yeah, and bringing that full circle, I think, because I still have a lot of questions on the Sumatran Rhino, is that I think this animal has, been largely confused as to what it actually is and how dire the circumstance is to actually lose an animal like this. But also, it's just a really interesting story. So what is the efforts going on now? Is there like a new idea? Is there like a collaborative effort to a direction we're going in?
There's a collaborative effort of a bunch of different researchers and organizations and groups, and including the Indonesian government, basically to try and find out what to try and do. So I did a big series on this last year, and the point of that series was basically, look, we only have 9 rhinos in captivity. Only 2 of them are known breeders. All the males but 1 are related, so they're brother, son, and father. Mm-hmm. And we only have 1 female that we know can actually breed. So the point of sort of what talking to lots of researchers, talking to government people, sitting down with people across the table in Indonesia. I spent 2 weeks in Indonesia researching this, and a lot of other time doing Skype calls and other things. The conclusion we came down to was we need to get more rhinos out of the wild. We need to look at these areas where the rhinos are basically doomed, where there may be only a few handful left. And then we also need to consider about taking a few rhinos out of places like Ray Cambus and Lucerne, where the population may be somewhat stronger, but we really need young, healthy females. We need new genetics. We now know how to breed the rhinos, which we didn't. It took us 20 years to figure that out. But we now know how to do it. So we need to get a few more rhinos out of the wild at least and start breeding. Last I heard, I believe that there is a coalition working on moving forward on this. The problem with all this is it moves too slow. The government bureaucracy is really can be really frustrating in Indonesia. And so one of the points of the stories is to really try and get the Indonesian government to sign off on this.
Well, it's a big decision. Thing. Like, who makes that?
It's a huge
that decision? It is the government.
It's the government.
Like, this is like that's what's so messed up, right? Is it not messed up, but like so interesting is that this is a species that I don't want to say belongs to the world, because I don't think that they belong to anybody, but it's the only animals left of this entire species of animals, and it ultimately comes down to a few individuals to like sign off on what happens to it. Is a really weird concept.
It is weird. And it officially in Indonesia, the Sumatran rhinos are owned by the government. The government officially owns all these rhinos, right? Whether they're captive or wild. It's a part of the government's, role as a representative of the people. Mm-hmm. So the government is the ones that make the final decision. So the NGOs basically provide an advisory expertise role, but they're not going to be able to say, hey, we're going to go take these rhinos out without permission from the government.
Right.
And then you're asking the government to make a risky, I mean, you saw that with Najak, right? The rhino that died.
Yeah.
You're asking them to put their step out and make a risky decision, which is not easy, to do this. So that's one reason why this has stalled for so long, and why there's been other parts of this story that are even more in some ways infuriating and frustrating have stalled, because the government is not wanting to put itself out there and to make these hard decisions. And the government itself is made up of a hierarchy of various different officials, many of whom don't return my calls.
Right.
They don't want to talk to journalists. They don't want but they're under a lot of pressure, and I understand. And there's some cultural differences in Indonesia than in places like America that make it very different. So, but from last I heard, that sounds like there's some movement on capturing some more rhinos, getting them into captivity. Hopefully, dear God, we will have some more breeding success. I've met with the team. I've met numbers of the team who work with these rhinos on a day-to-day basis, and these are amazing people who have dedicated their lives to coming out to this remote area, leaving their family behind for weeks at a time, living in this remote area where the rhinos are kept, because they're kept inside the national park in a sanctuary, and basically doing everything they can to breed these animals. And they've had 2 successful births now there. And they do amazing work, and they're using all their science, they're using all their knowledge. So the resources are there, the people are there. What we need is a few more rhinos at least to get us started. And I think on the flip side, we need to really find out how many rhinos are in Lucerne, how many rhinos are in Wake Cambus. I'm constantly amazed that we don't have that we know exactly to a number how many Javan rhinos there are. Right? Javan rhinos survive in one population in Ujung Kulon. We know the exact number. They do a survey every year, or not every year maybe, but every 3 or 4 years they have a survey, and they can count the exact number on camera traps. I don't understand why we can't. I mean, I know that it's different terrain, it's more remote, it's other issues, but
it's important.
It boggles my mind.
It's important
that we don't have that.
Yeah, and I'm going to also, just before I forget, for people listening, I'm going to link in the show notes Paul Hilton's work in the Lucerne ecosystem. And it is, for people who don't know, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And it's the only last living place where rhinos, tigers, and orangutans and elephants. Thank you. Yeah, I knew I forgot a big one. And elephants,
the big 4.
All live together in harmony. Am I right about the tiger? The tiger's there too.
Yeah, the tiger's there. Yeah. And I think I believe they have. Wait, do they? Let me see. I think they have tapir too. So you could say the big Asian 5.
Yeah, are all living together in harmony, and it's under incredible stress, mostly from palm oil, from surprisingly very large American corporations that should not be doing that. But Paul Hilton does a lot of really important work in that area, and I'm going to link it so people can support and learn more if they want to.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting. There's been development projects that have been planned for that area, large scale roads and things that have So it's one of the most. It's probably arguably the most important area in Sumatra right now. And Sumatra as an island has one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. It is ecologically under complete distress right now. It's a beautiful place, but it's hard to go to because you see all the destruction. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, though, it has millions of people that it needs to feed, clothe, provide education for, housing. These people deserve a good life. So it's one of those really difficult issues to try and figure out the balance. But it's a beautiful country, or a beautiful island, I should say. Indonesia itself is quite amazing.
Yeah, I think in general, it's really hard to take just strictly a Western perspective and understand what the intricacies of the actual grassroots level situation is. But I heard a really interesting story in Borneo where there's a lot of palm oil deforestation that are hurting the orangutans, that when they went into the communities, there was a lot. Basically, everyone was wondering why they were going down and chopping down. It was either for palm oil or for charcoal and deforesting. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, there's no access to healthcare for a lot of the people in Borneo. And something to the fact that, like, if you broke your arm, you could likely die just from the infection because you just didn't have a way to take care of it. So an NGO went in and said, okay, for this community here that's been known to be doing a lot of logging and deforestation, we're going to provide free healthcare to everybody here. But if one tree comes down, or if we hear anything getting impacted, then everybody loses it. And all of a sudden, the rebound and like the ability for that community to stop deforesting but still get what they need is really, really interesting. So I think I encourage like a lot of conservation to start thinking through those creative solutions, and also not just like blanket statement things. Like, people don't generally just have apathy to wildlife in these areas. It's that they're in tough situations, you know?
Well, and I think, if I just want to get the name out, but I think the group you're talking about is Health and Harmony in Borneo. I think that's what they're called. They do incredible work.
Super interesting.
Yeah, and that is a really innovative way. And the other thing that people need to know is, like, it's not like all these communities are pro, like, hey, let's go cut down all the forest and turn it into palm oil. A lot of the communities are dead set against it, and some of the communities are split. You know, and so and the reason why they would be dead set against it is oftentimes the communities aren't getting much benefit, right? The big corporation comes in, they do a large monoculture, the palm oil goes out, and working for palm oil is as a laborer is incredibly difficult. It doesn't pay well. You're using lots of pesticides. There's been a lot of labor violations. It's a really, really horrible job. The one place where palm oil has been really good for the economy in places like Malaysia and Indonesia is for small holders, small farmers basically can grow it on their land. You know, and that's one area where it has been a real boon. But when these large-scale companies come in, cut down all the forests that people have been using, hunting in, fishing in, collecting, materials in for centuries, and all of a sudden they lose all their forest and their wildlife and their hunting. Boom, a lot of these places they've kind of woken up in a lot of places, and they realize we don't want this kind of development, right? We don't want this kind of. We want smarter development. We want development that takes in our considerations like healthcare.
Yeah, well, it's almost
right?
like, in a weird way, some of these corporations are essentially similar to the people running poaching rings in Africa, right? Except they're just in a suit and tie and buttoned up with the governments. I mean, in a certain scenario, when you think of the ways in which they're devastating certain environmental areas, but using people who are in really desperate situations to do that, and giving them pennies on the dollar and then really reaping the benefits. Like, I always thought of like being a poacher in Africa, like, it's easy to think, oh my God, who could do that? It's awful. And it is. But I also know that if I was struggling to feed my family, like, all of a sudden you might have to make some tough decisions. But the person who actually is ultimately pulling that trigger in Africa is not the person who's seeing the most money from that. And I think it's very similar in what's going on in palm oil in Indonesia.
Yes.
I'm going on a rant.
No, that's fine. But I think it's important for people, again, this is the complexity, right? In the context is the money tends to flow to the top, and the people on the ground, everyone's yelling about palm oil, but I've actually been there. I've seen it. It is decimating. But it's not serving local people's needs in a lot of ways, but it is changing the economy. It's shaping, it's creating, and the reason why the governments are often behind it is because, again, they're getting support from these companies. They're getting paid sometimes from these companies. They're getting, and so there's corruption involved, and so it's not a black and white story. And to your point about poachers or about people who would, who could do that. Well, imagine your little sister is sick, and the only way you're going to be able to afford medicine is to go and shoot a rhino,
right?
To save her life. Like, these are the kind of stories that people have to live with on a day-to-day basis. 100%. And I think we as Westerners and as conservationists, like, oh my God, I can't. No. And the real villains in this are not those people. The real villains are the people at the top who are making a mint off this stuff and who are breaking so many laws and
just exploiting
so
everybody.
much corruption. Yeah. And they're not just, often the people at the top aren't just, it's not just poaching. They're often involved in drugs. They're often involved in sex trafficking. They're often involved in illegal logging, which can be just as brutal and just as deadly as poaching. So that's where the systematic kind of trouble comes in. And I think blaming the poacher is often the wrong, that it's not understanding the reality of the situation.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to mention on the Sumatran Rhino before we move on is it really resonated a lot with me. My favorite director in the entire world, and I can never pronounce his last name right, is Louis Hose, or the guy who did The Cove and Racing Extinction.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
He's just an absolute rock star. He has a new documentary on veganism coming out pretty soon too, which I heard is really interesting. I'm not a vegan, but Maybe I will be after I watch that documentary. But
Right?
the
He'll convince us all.
but he says, and he kind of gets emotional because he's one of the characters in Racing Extinction, and he talks about how when he was involved in conservation and environmental journalism, there was the Chinese river dolphin, which there was like 30 left in the world, and he just kept thinking to himself in the back of his mind that, oh, somebody will take care of it because there's only 30 left, and now it's completely extinct and wiped from the world. And like he like breaks down in the documentary, and I think it's very, you can draw a lot of parallels to the Sumatran rhino and the fact that somebody's got to step in and do something.
And the first article the first article I ever wrote was about the Baji, the Yangtze River dolphin that went extinct. Same thing. Yeah, that was and I think that was maybe an awakening for a number of people, in that, you'd think someone will do something. And we're seeing that right now with the vaquita, right? You got a dozen left, 12 left. Pretty much ensured extinction.
What's the vaquita?
And so the vaquita is this small porpoise, lives in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't want to get this wrong. I think it might be the world's smallest porpoise, but I'm probably wrong. Let me look that up quick. So it's the most rare mammal, really, one of the most rare mammals in the world. And it's threatened because of the gill netting that's being done in this region for a fish called the totoboa.
Mm-hmm.
And the totoboa has a certain part of it that's a Chinese medicinal delicacy, right? So again, you have these gangs that are going in, fishing to beat hell. And this has been happening over decades. The population of the vaquita, we've been watching it go down, 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 down. And it's a beautiful little porpoise. It has like it's sometimes called a panda porpoise because it has a ring around its eye. And basically the vaquita gets caught up in these nets and drowns, right? And it's only, unlike most marine mammals, they move, they migrate, or they're found in different places. The vaquita is literally only found in this one place and doesn't migrate.
Okay.
So it's vanishing. And, the part of the story that no one really talks about is the totoboa is also vanishing. And I might be saying that wrong as well, the totoboa. I don't know if that's exactly how you pronounce it. But we're losing this species, and we keep thinking someone's going to do something. And I think it was last year, or maybe let's think it was last year. They tried to capture a couple for captive breeding because, they're down to, and one got overly stressed, so they let it go, and then another one died.
Ugh.
And then they said, we're stopping this. We're not going to catch anymore. But that means there's really nothing left. And unless something changes real fast, the species is gone.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point to things where captive breeding has worked. I mean, the California condor is a great example, where I think there were this is an educated guess, but like less than 30 left in the world. Mm-hmm. And they brought him in and got a captive breeding program going, and now they're killing it. They're doing really well. I mean, I camped out in Ojai a couple months ago, and I just saw one like taking off, and it was beautiful. And you look up in the
wild.
Oh yeah, you look up in the sky.
That's
and
awesome.
You'll see 6 of them flying around at a time. Like it's not that they're rare to see anymore. It's awesome. And I also have a rule on this podcast that I will not allow myself to get too negative for like a period of 30 times for 30 minutes, because in conservation, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole in that sense. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about like, what are you optimistic about in conservation right now? Like, is there any programs or ideologies or just progression that you're excited about?
Wow. Well, let me just jump. I want to something that's optimistic, I think, and I think something that doesn't get enough credit, because I'm doing this whole story in Sumatran Rhinos, is, the zoo world gets a lot of criticism, and I think a lot of it is somewhat warranted. But you have some of the best zoos in the world, like with the California condor. Zoos were hugely involved in that. The Cincinnati Zoo basically is the only reason why we have Sumatran rhinos breeding anymore, because they cracked that nut and they spent years doing it. So you have these animals that we have seen come back, right? That we have seen. So I think people often dismiss captive breeding as a problem, breeding animals in captivity, and I agree. Like, that's not my first thought either. But when you get animals down to like the lion tamarin, the California condor, the black-footed ferret, the European bison was down to 12 animals, and only through zoos and captive breeding was it successfully. And now I think there's 400 in Europe, and I've seen them in Poland. So you have these stories, I think, where if you can get some really good dedicated conservationists together, you can save, these animals that are on the brink of extinction. And it doesn't always mean captive breeding. I'm not advocating that.
Right.
I think the Komodo Dragon is a really good story where, like, you protect the habitat, you turn it into a tourist mecca, and all of a sudden the Komodo Dragon is, it's not doing perfect, but we're not going to lose it anytime soon.
Yeah.
And that's an animal that could have easily been wiped out.
Same thing with the American bison. Like the bison, like
Right?
you go to Yellowstone and you're like, these things used to be struggling. They're everywhere. And it's like, it's all same thing. You just drive down the main drag in Jackson Hole and you'll see them all over the place.
Or you look at bald eagles in America
Mhm.
now, right? To the very edge of extinction. They're everywhere.
I heard an
because
interesting
we banned
story
DDT.
that I don't know if it's true, but did you know, I think it was Ben Franklin was very against using the bald eagle as America's
I think I've heard
mascot.
that, yeah.
Because I guess
He wanted the turkey, didn't he?
and he said that the bald eagle is naturally an animal that scavenges off of other people's kills and like that is just like not a good demonstration of like strength and nobility.
Oh, that's
Isn't
funny.
that interesting?
Yeah, it's probably true too, But like, so I live in Minnesota, and one thing I found out recently is like the turkey almost went extinct in Minnesota, the wild turkey. And now I drive my daughter to school and we see wild turkeys running, So
I think everybody
are
got the fact that you
positives.
live in Minnesota based off of the way you got this celadon in a bag.
in a bag, right? Yeah, right. See, and we can't even hear it sometimes. But there are these positive stories. I think the problem that we're running into, and this might get slightly depressing for a moment, but is we have 7 billion plus people. We're on the road to between 9 and 11 billion. We have climate change. We have ocean acidification. We have mass deforestation. We have a massive wildlife trade. There are so many things right now. We have the overuse of pesticides and herbicides. We have insect populations now seemingly collapsing. There are so many things that are so large scale that I think our response as conservationists has to be more ambitious. It has to be more hopeful, yes, but it has to be bigger than what we've been doing. One of the ideas that I find very intriguing, and I also think is, on the one hand, I'm like, this is absolutely crazy, but on the other hand, I'm like, this is amazing. Because it is so ambitious, is E.O. Wilson's Half Earth Initiative.
Hell yeah.
So E.O. Wilson, for people that don't know, is one of the greatest living scientists. I got the chance to actually do a phone interview with him a couple years ago, which was one of the highlights of my career. He's an incredible evolutionary scientist. He's obsessed with ants as his big specialty, but basically insects. But he has come out with this idea of setting aside half of the Earth as conservation areas. Basically, the idea is if you set aside half of the Earth, I think the extinction rate would be 10 to 20%, as opposed to a third of the Earth, and the extinction rate jumps up to like 50 or 60% of species.
Oh, interesting.
We cannot afford, and this is this whole thing that he developed with another researcher on how much habitat you need to preserve species, right? How much habitat can a species lose before you start to how much biodiversity will be lost when you lose a certain amount of habitat? We cannot afford to lose 50 to 60% of our species, because then we're talking about not just ecological. Well, we're talking about ecological collapse, which is really a collapse in our own civilization. So his idea is to set aside 50%, both on land and on sea. The reason why this is absolutely mind-bogglingly ambitious is, of course, where are you going to find 50%, right? Like, how
does that
are
include
humans
the ocean?
actually? I think it would be separate. So I think you do 50% in the oceans, or I'd say maybe more in the oceans. Why not?
Yeah.
We could. And you do 50% on land.
Okay.
But he talks specifically about 50% on land.
Okay. Yeah, that gets harder.
It's ambitious.
It is.
It's crazy. And you start to crunch the numbers, and we have about, I think, over 50% of the land that is undeveloped about now. There are certain countries, is it Colombia or Venezuela? Anyway, there are a few different countries that have over 50% of their land protected.
That's awesome.
But it's not the rich countries. It's poorer countries. I think Bhutan has like 37%. Bhutan. These are smaller countries that have done more for conservation than sort of the U.S. and, France and other places.
Well, the cool thing, too, is I actually heard you always associate China with the endangered species trade, and there's obviously a lot of negativity when it comes to conservation for China, but apparently they're really becoming very progressive at putting land aside strictly for
Yeah.
altruistic purposes, not necessarily like economical benefits
Sure.
for wildlife, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and China, I mean, we can say a lot. We can bash China till the cows
For
come
sure.
home. But if we're gonna survive climate change, China's probably our biggest
Yeah,
asset right
yeah.
now. So you got to give them props on that.
Well, they've seen the
So
downside of things. This is another thing I heard, that they know how bad smog has gotten in that area, and that
yes, yeah,
continuing on the path that they're continuing on is not going to work.
yes, they know they've come to the realization that this is unsustainable. And so they're making a hard U-turn, which is way more than the U.S. is doing right now, than the U.S. has ever
No,
done.
the U.S.
And
is
it's way more than Canada's
regressing.
doing.
I mean, we're giving
Yes.
away areas of land to do coal mining and stuff that nobody's
Yep.
used since like the 40s.
We're back to crazy. So, but I think what's really interesting about Half Earth is the ambition and the hopefulness of it. I'm not personally. I don't know if we could ever get to 50% of the Earth protected. But what if we got to 40%? And when I've talked to E.O. Wilson, I asked him and other people who support this idea. I'm like, okay, what about indigenous people? Like, are you going to move all the indigenous people? And they're like, no.
Yeah, they're
This includes indigenous lands. What we'll do is we'll give the lands to the indigenous people, because indigenous people are some of the best protectors we've realized
100%.
late. Yeah, we give them the land and we say, okay, this is yours to protect. We give land rights to the indigenous peoples. So that's a huge chunk right there. And they also say we're not talking about every one of these areas has to be a quote unquote national park. Some of these areas could still allow fishing. They could allow hunting. They could allow maybe building to some extent. They could allow other things. It doesn't have to be completely off limits to everything, because that you're never going to get 50% that way, and you're never going to get people to buy in. But you have different regulations for different places, what suits local people, what suits the local government, what suits different things, but you still have it set aside for either nature protection or, in this case, we're going to need a lot of restoration.
Mhm.
We're going to need rewilding. We're going to need all these wonderful things that conservationists have been talking about for the last couple of decades, but nobody's really doing on the scales that we need it at. So I think that's one of the more exciting, optimistic, and one of the things that I think that's so cool about the idea is that instead of us being like, oh my God, everything's going horrible, we're all, this is all terrible, we're talking about something that's hopeful. We're talking about, what if humans can be so selfless that we actually say, no, we're going to set aside this much land for our future generations of humans and for all the other species that deserve this planet that lived here. What if we could actually get to that point? Well, and that is a hopeful message. That is an audacious message, and it gives conservationists something exciting to talk about instead of just gloom and doom and depressing.
Yeah, and it gives an actionable goal on something that kind of removes a lot of the complication, right? In a weird way. Like, it's obviously not it is complicated, but it's not dealing with local governments and dealing with corporations and getting involved in all the intricacies of each geographic region, but more, let's set aside these pieces of land and see what we can do and get conservation back to what conservation used to be at its genesis, right? Which is just putting aside places of land that are ultimately wild. I think that
and it's a really easy message to get out publicly. Whether you like it or hate it, it's easy to understand. Whereas trying to explain other kinds of conservation methods today are really complex and complicated, and it's a lot harder to wrap your minds around. But trying to say, hey, let's set aside half the earth for nature and indigenous people, and maybe allow some things here and there, for our progeny, for ourselves. Boom. It's a lot easier to explain.
It's also tangible in a way that I think is really important, as a lot of giving has, over the last 20 years, has focused more on concrete results in transparency when you're giving, in the sense that it's always been hard in giving to an organization like the Red Cross or something like that. I'm not saying the Red Cross does bad work. I'm just more saying, like, when you write $100 to the Red Cross, it's very hard to sometimes understand where that money's going to.
Yeah.
And maybe they've changed
Yeah.
that. I'm not well versed in the Red Cross. I'm not bashing them at all. But
Yeah.
But like I look at like the Rainforest Trust or something based in Virginia where they can say, okay, if you give $100, you can actually buy like an acre and a half in Indonesia or something like that to actually parcel off pieces of land.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to, you can remove a lot of bureaucracy in NGOs by doing something where it's just strict land buying and getting 50% of the earth back, right? And putting those into those wild areas. And I think a lot of people would want to donate to that.
Yeah, land is a concrete thing, you know, and natural ecosystems. It's not trying to say like, well, we need to set up this new organization that will make sure that logging is done in a certain way and it's only done in certain places, and we're gonna, you know, that's so hard. But land is just very concrete, and giving rights to indigenous people is also incredibly concrete, and you know would at least somewhat allow them to develop in the ways that they want to develop, rather than always constantly, you know, the Western world telling them how they should develop. So I think that is a very hopeful thing, and I'm curious. You know, as a journalist, I try not to get too like, I'm not going to be too rah one way or another on different issues because my job is to report. But I'm curious to see where it goes. I'm really curious to see. It's very interesting to watch which scientists are jumping on, and which scientists are criticizing it. It's interesting to see what NGOs are saying about it, if they're saying anything. Most of them are keeping silent right now. But it's been really interesting to watch it kind of play out a little bit. And I'm really curious to see where it goes and if it takes off or doesn't, you know. But I do think we need, clearly what we're doing right now in the conservation world is not big enough, is not enough to sort of turn around, just like with climate change. Everything that we're doing is too small. It's too small scale. It's not unified enough. It's not large enough. The message isn't big enough. It's not reaching enough. All those things, right? We kind of all know that, I think, at least in the environmental conservation world. So I think we just need some big, bold, big ideas, and maybe some of them are going to fail. Maybe some of them won't work, and maybe some of them will be laughed out. But like, we need to get more creative, and we need some of those ideas like that.
Amen. Totally agree. I know we're getting close here, so I'm going to go into some rapid fire, real quick questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Favorite environmental book that you would recommend to people?
Oh, favorite. You know, I love The Song of the Dodo. That's the title, right? Yeah, I think that's the title. I'm gonna look it up just because I want to get the author of his name right. He's a wonderful journalist. He's one of my favorite. Yes, The Son of the Dodo: Island Biogeography in the Age of Extinction, 1997. David Quammen.
Okay.
So a lot of the stuff I've been talking about right now today about E.O. Wilson biogeography, about setting aside how much land for how many species. He tells a remarkable story of how that was all discovered. It's a story about extinction. It's a story about loss, but it's also just a wonderful story about science. And it's a wonderful kind of, I think it's a really good introduction into how researchers look at extinction. So I think that's one of my favorites.
How about documentary?
Favorite like environmental documentary?
Conservation.
Oh man. I've gotten to see some documentaries that haven't been released yet that I really like, but I'm not going to get into those because they haven't been released yet. You know, I'm going to go with, I know this sucks, but I love David Attenborough. You know, I love his old stuff. I love the Planet Earth series. So I'm not going to go with, I probably should think of something a little bit more.
No, I mean, if we talk about getting appreciation for nature, I think Planet Earth is as good as it gets.
Yeah. And I mean, I do have issues with Planet Earth, and that sometimes I feel like they could set aside more of a conservation message. And I think they've been working on that.
Yeah, we've talked about that a little bit on this podcast.
Yeah, that's an issue. That's different. But, you know, showing my daughter those, she's 7, you know, that's such an amazing way for children to, you know, and we get her out camping. We take her to places and do all sorts of things. Obviously, her dad's an environmental journalist, so she's way too informed about climate change and things. But be able to just show her some of those things and those amazing moments, you know, I think that we do need to. What it reminds people is that there is still wilderness worth saving, and there are still species. And I love that they don't always just focus on, you know, they do these intimate stories about species that people never heard of. So I'm gonna go with David Attenborough. All right,
I'll accept that.
Just his whole thing.
No, he's the Titan.
Yeah, he is.
If you could put a billboard on the side of the highway that disseminates one message in 10 words or less that you think is just important to get out there, what is that?
I would have to think a long time about what the message would be, but it would be something about climate change. I feel like we're at a period in our history where we've been handed this issue that is really beyond our species' ability to comprehend. And I feel like we've already missed several decades of being able to really enact change on that. And it's not the problem with the funny thing about climate change is we know the solution. And the solution isn't impossible. It's actually very, in some ways, quite easy, but we just are unwilling to do it. So I don't know what it would say because I don't know how to convince people of that. I don't know how to convince people of it. If I did, I'd be tweeting that out all the time.
Climate change is real.
Climate change is real. It's not fake news. I don't know, man. But I feel like that, if we don't deal with climate change, everything else, and this is not even just environmentally, everything else, society-wise, politics, it's gonna get worse and it's gonna get uglier because people under that much stress, we're not gonna be nice to each other. I worry about that. So,
and then the last question is, excuse me, where can people check out your work?
Okay, so I'm a freelancer, which means I write for lots of different places. So I have a website called jeremyhance.com. Every article I write goes up on that website. A link to it will go up there. So if you really want to follow me, you can follow that blog. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also, a lot of what I'm writing about is Mongabay. I write for a lot. And I have a Sumatran Rhino series coming out there probably in the next month or two. I've been writing for The Guardian for a long time. I've got a story coming out in HuffPost soon. But basically, I'm kind of all over the place as a freelancer. So that's if you want to find me on Twitter, great. That's a good place to kind of see what I'm up to. Or jeremyhance.com, or just you can even shoot me an email.
Awesome. Well, I'll link all that stuff in the show notes. And thank you so much for one, all the work you do, and two, for taking the time for being on the podcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.